Does God exist? One reason to suspect that he doesn't is the problem of divine hiddenness. And in this video, I'm going to explain what that problem is and why it's an issue for theism. But first, let's lay some groundwork. The kind of God many imagine to exist isn't an aloof king, but rather is responsive to relationships with his creatures. It makes sense to think of a loving God in this way, for in our own experience, there's something uniquely valuable about a parent engaging in relational love and self-giving, as opposed to remaining coldly distant. Something intrinsically worthwhile about not just having a general willing of the child's good, but being open to a relationship with them in a way that they could recognize. If this is true of flawed human love, then if we're going to throw around phrases like perfect love to describe what God would be like should he exist, then surely it's also true of that. And importantly, if the God of traditional theism is real, he's said to be omnibenevolent, among other things. Given the other attributes ascribed to this God, there would be nothing separating him from establishing a relationship with his creatures if he so desired. This doesn't mean God would have to operate like an annoying extrovert that won't leave you alone, or zap you with his glory all at once either. And yes, that relationship would be different than the kinds of relationships we have with other humans, but that's hardly an objection to his ability to establish one. To have a meaningful relationship with this God, though, it's plausible to think that you'd need to believe he exists. As J.L. Schellenberg explains, quote, "Without believing in God, you can't think of yourself as praying to God and expect to be heard. You can't feel God's presence, identifying it as such. You can't try to find God's will for your life or experience God's forgiveness. Now, you can do other, seemingly similar things, such as praying without any expectation of being heard, perhaps motivated by hope that there is a God and that God will someday respond. But to be in a conscious relationship with God now, with all that alone brings, you need now to believe that God exists." Unquote. Since this is true, God, should he exist, wouldn't prevent us from being able to do that. Now, belief has an involuntary flavor to it. I can't, for example, make myself believe in underwater chickens, should you suggest the existence of such strange creatures to me.
Choose to believe in the sea chickens. Do you believe it yet?
My body of evidence doesn't support their existence, and I can't change my beliefs on a dime. What does this have to do with God? Well, if he's all-knowing, all-powerful, and perfectly good, arguably he has the means and motivation to make himself known to each person in an unmistakable way, such that anyone who ends up in a state of non-belief can only get there by resisting God. Basically, if God is perfectly loving, he's going to set things up such that not believing in him will always be the fault of the creature, analogous to a light that remains on unless we close our eyes. It follows then that if God exists, there wouldn't be any non-resistant non-belief. The problem is that it seems pretty clear that there is. What looks like honest doubt about God surrounds us, and there were times in history where the idea of an omni-God had no traction, either because people didn't think about it or sincerely believed in something else. Taking these considerations together, here's how they can be put into an argument against God's existence. What you're seeing on screen now is the more complicated version, but it's not completely necessary to get to the heart of the matter. Here's Schellenberg explaining a simpler version.
Think about three scenarios. God exists, and there are no non-believers. That is, God exists and perhaps there are other people too, and if there are, all of them believe that God exists. The second scenario is one in which God exists, and not everybody is a believer. There are some people who believe, some people who don't believe, but all of those who don't believe fail to believe because they're resisting God in some way. And so all of the non-belief in the world in the second scenario is resistant non-belief. And now the third scenario is one in which God exists, and some people believe in God, some people don't believe in God, with the added wrinkle now that of those who don't believe in God, some are resistant, but some are not. And now you can take the central claim of the argument as saying something like this: the first two scenarios are possible if God exists, and the third is impossible. So if God exists, there are no non-resistant non-believers. The second premise, perhaps obviously, is going to be, yeah, there are non-resistant non-believers, from which the conclusion follows there's no God.
So, how have theists responded to this argument? One major move has been for people to put on their tinfoil hat and deny the existence of non-resistant non-believers, which is what I'll be focusing on here. I'll elaborate on why this is problematic in a minute. But first I want to clear the air of any potential misunderstandings. First, focusing on the character of the person making the argument is a smokescreen. The idea is that someone claiming to be a non-resistant non-believer and also using this as an argument against God's existence may be telling on themselves in a way. I don't think that follows, but even if it did, it wouldn't matter. The burden for the person denying that non-resistant non-believers exist is to argue that there is not a single person in human history that could fit into that category. No former believers, lifelong seekers, converts to non-theistic religions, or isolated people groups. Second, there is an overly demanding attitude taken on by some objectors, as if the person offering the argument needs to prove the existence of non-resistant non-believers with 100% certainty, which is false. We only need to give good reasons to think that they exist. The final misconception is failing to understand what Schellenberg is really getting at. The reason that non-resistant non-believers are incompatible with God's existence is that non-resistant non-belief is incompatible with God's existence. Take a look at how his more in-depth argument is formulated. To deny the existence of non-resistant non-believers as Schellenberg understands them, you have to deny that any state of non-resistant non-belief has ever occurred, and affirm that every instance of non-belief is inherently resistant, not simply prove that humans are fallible and don't always have pristine motives across time. Okay, on to reasons why this isn't a good objection. And as a side note, I'm mainly going to be responding to Christians who object in this way, because that's my experience. First, what's motivating this most of the time is... But Christianity isn't true anyway. And even if it is, the Bible isn't inerrant. So even if you do interpret Paul to be claiming that there is no non-resistant non-belief in Romans 1, you should just get comfortable with Paul being wrong. The dude thought he was going to be alive when Jesus came back. He was probably wrong about lots of stuff. Anywho, the most basic reason objecting to the existence of non-resistant non-belief is dumb and wrong is that it involves adopting a radical skepticism towards mundane human testimony. How do we know what people's beliefs, values, and overall internal states are? Through their testimony. Taking an innocent until proven guilty approach to this sort of testimony from others is a normal thing that we do all the time. We don't, however, apply this same deference when people say things like, "Little green aliens visit me every morning." This is why it's funny that some Christians dismiss the mountain of testimonial evidence suggesting that people can sincerely disbelieve in God and instead believe a guy came back to life and floated into the sky based on decades after the fact written documents that are copying each other verbatim from thousands of years ago. And by the way, were also written by non-eyewitnesses. They're exchanging the truth of a mundane claim with tons of supporting evidence behind it, for belief in an extraordinary claim with much, much less supporting evidence. And no, the veracity of this claim does not depend on the claim that testimony about people's beliefs and values is identical to perceptual testimony. You simply aren't grasping the point, if that's your response. The point is, it's reasonable to initially trust people say so about ordinary stuff. And objecting to non-resistant non-belief involves an unwarranted skepticism towards testimony and our ability to even somewhat be reliable about assessing our own internal states. And as I've said before, if the Christians who object in this way were to apply their skepticism consistently, they'd never be able to have assurance of their salvation. They believe human nature is so wicked and corrupt that we're in a situation where every non-theist who has ever lived was deceived on some level. They also believe some people are deceived about their own salvation. There's no way for them to have any reasonable assurance that they aren't one of those people, because every method they could use to try and prove they're not will rely on the accuracy of their own assessment of themselves in some way. Something fallen humans apparently can't be trusted to use. Plus, I doubt they would take such skepticism seriously from anyone else. If Muslims claim that Christians know deep down that worshipping a man as God is idolatry, and that they're only doing so because they're resisting Allah, they would think it's absurd for Muslims not to be moved an inch by massive amounts of testimony to the contrary. Similarly, there are some atheists who believe that all religious people are lying to themselves, and that evidence and arguments never play a role in convincing people. Religious people don't tend to like this, and think testimony is sufficient to rebut this sort of dogmatism. If so, then testimony that non-resistant non-belief is a thing should rebut yours. Speaking of dogmatism, a lot of the times the foundation of dogmatic people's faith is religious experience or the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit. Tap here for an explanation of why that really shouldn't make anyone too confident.